years in Israel, Stan challenged the boundaries between human rights activism and the campus. On the one hand, he insisted that the campus was a political space and that these attempts to keep the Israeli campus apolitical or neutral are really amounted to support for the occupying regime. On the other hand, he lent his academic knowledge and remarkable intellectual abilities to political and human rights activists who were fighting off the campus to end the occupation of the Palestinian territories. I vividly remember the first time I heard Stan speak at the Hebrew University Faculty Club in 1990. He was speaking about the human rights movement in Israel and South Africa. This was at the height of the Intifada, the first Intifada. Tens of thousands of Palestinians were being arrested, tortured, and imprisoned. From Mons Campus, where the campus was, one could hear the loudspeakers of the border police enforcing the curfew on the nearby village of Isawiya. One could smell the burning tires, yet the lecturers and the students went about their business as if everything was normal. It was as if there was no intifada happening just around us off the campus. That same year, in 1990, Stan had been a founding member of the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, and a year earlier we formed B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. We were despised as an enemy from within, and we were called traitors. Stan brought us to the forefront of academic discourse, comparing us to the human rights organization that were at the very same time celebrating the end of apartheid. In his brilliant academic lecture, he presented our human rights work as meaningful, overly restrained, and definitely worthy of being studied and taught. I remember this lecture not only because it was exceptionally courageous, the first and sadly the last time I witnessed such a brave discussion on campus, but also I remember hoping throughout the lecture that Stan was wrong. It was hard for me to hear about our self-censorship, our tendency to focus on individual rather than collective rights, and our non-political path as human rights organizations. And it was very hard to hear Stan's pessimist observation of the path we took. Back then in 1990, I wanted to believe that if Israelis only knew what their army was doing to the Palestinians, if we could only document the human rights violation reliably, fairly, and clearly, if we could only get the information to the general public or to the policymakers, the occupation will surely end. At the time, I was also not aware of his pessimism. Stan's favorite Jewish joke was a recording on a Jewish answer phone that announces, "At the sound of the beep, please leave your bad news." Or the Jewish telegram, "Start worrying, details to follow." The world is full of what Saul Bellow calls reality instructors, Stan wrote. People who tell you that everything is bad and getting worse. So wise up, get tough, buddy. The world is even worse than it seems. Sadly, Stan was right then. As much as we tried, the military occupation had not ended, and the situation has just become worse. But Stan did much more than writing and talking. He also took action. During the Intifada, the Minister of Justice was the invited speaker at the Faculty of Law graduation ceremony. Stan wrote a personal letter to the students, explaining why he, Stan, could not take part in the ceremony and why a minister responsible for human rights violations was not a worthy speaker. He went and passed out copies of the letter to each and every student in the crowd. His efforts to challenge perception of the campus as apolitical, and bring the voices of human rights and equality to the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus were for the most part not very successful. For example, since 1988, for months and years, all the Palestinian universities in the occupied territories were closed under order from the military governor. And so were all the schools and the kindergartens. Stan and I tried to organize a 2-hour solidarity strike of lectures at the Hebrew University. All we managed to achieve was support from 10 lecturers and a threat from the president of the university that those who participated would be fired. Stan later wrote about the campus. I quote, "Everything that makes up a normal university was in place at Mount Scopus. Students, courses, reading lists, libraries, departments, faculties. But every so often I had the vaguely paranoid feeling that things were not quite right. I was relieved to find out that this was not my own autistic fantasies. Visitors and newcomers would also sometimes get the feeling that these were virtual universities, that they were on a Hollywood set and would wake up the next morning to find everything removed, the whole place empty. It felt like in a movie in which there was no occupation, no intifada, and the university was set in New Zealand." Sadly, as Stan promised us, things got worse in recent years. Now organizations like Academic Monitor or Im Tirtzu are monitoring and recording classes and then demanding the dismissal of lecturers who express political opinions that are not in line with the Israeli consensus. Last month I taught a class of graduate students Stan's book, States of Denial. And then we had a discussion. What is that we are denying? I asked them. They had many answers. Some talked about the meat that we are eating. Some talked about how we fear car accidents, but we don't really think about them. What about the occupation? I asked them. After a long time that the word occupation didn't come up. The occupation? They asked me. Some were not sure what is that I'm talking about. Others said, but the very word that you use when you say the occupation is a political statement. It doesn't belong here to the campus. And there was one who was particularly puzzled. And he asked, how can you use the term occupation? It implies that there is an occupier and an occupied. That's not the situation here. All of them agreed that it was the first time they ever heard this word on campus. Stan's unique contribution went beyond making the campus a site of discussion and subversion. He also brought academic knowledge off the campus to us activists who were struggling against the occupation. He gave the Israeli and Palestinian human rights movement a connection to academic knowledge that had not existed until then. His ability to illustrate, learn, and teach various theories gave our political activism in the human rights movement a new depth, which gave us confidence and taught us that there were other people in the world who were thinking like us, that there were other people who shared our beliefs, that detention without trial is immoral, that torture is never justifiable, even if, according to Israeli law then, it was permitted to use moderate physical pressure, and that we could learn from other experiences of human rights organizations in other conflict zones. Stan and I wrote together the first report on torture of Palestinians in Israeli prisons. When we were writing during the first Intifada, more than 100,000 Palestinians were detained, and at least, despite our efforts to estimate low, over 80,000 of them subjected to torture. We did our research and prepared the press conference and the publication of the report while the Gulf War began. We sat with our gas masks as siren blared outside. We didn't know then that Saddam Hussein didn't really have chemical weapons, and that if he had chemical weapons, those masks would not help us anyway. But we were very carefully asking ourselves, how could we explain to Israelis, as they are sitting now during the war in their sealed room, that it was not acceptable to torture Palestinians, even when the Israeli media was depicting Palestinians dancing on the roof, full of joy after every missile Saddam managed to land in Tel Aviv. Stan told us, between the sirens, about the importance of the struggle against torture in French discourse during the War of Algeria. He told us about the history of and the changing perceptions of pain and punishment. He insisted that the first report on torture in Israel meet the highest academic standards. I remember hours of discussions about how to present the security services interrogation methods and how to translate the stick figure depictions of the positions in which people were tied and tortured. There were people, even at the board of B'Tselem at the time, who asked us not to use the word torture. There were other people who asked us not to publish the report in English. But we insisted. My confidence came from my absolute trust in Stan. The report had enormous media impact. Graphic drawings of standard torture methods were widely reproduced. 2 investigation commissions were formed to check our allegations. And a taboo subject was now discussed openly. Yet for some years, very little has changed. Stan tried to understand how is it that the information about torture has been received but not registered, and why it sank into consciousness without producing shifts in policy or public opinions. His work about how information about human rights violation is transmitted was not only theoretical, it helped us think through and change the ways in which we produced the reports. And it reminded us always to ask his question: what happens after the report? Today, torture occurs less in Israel. It hasn't been eradicated. We didn't manage to have the interrogations videotaped or even recorded at all. But following our reports, following dozens of high court petitions, and finally the 1999 verdict prohibiting torture, the abuse and torture to which most Palestinian prisoners in Israel were subjected were increasingly monitored, documented, and performed under caution. Now they are more focused on the individuals rather than the vast majority of prisoners, as was previously the case. Next Sunday, we will hold a memorial for Stan in Jerusalem. His Israeli and Palestinian friends will meet to honor and remember him. So very rarely do we meet today, Israelis and Palestinians. The policy of separation, it's the walls, the checkpoints, the separate roads. This policy has succeeded in tearing the peace and human rights community into small pieces. This policy was sowing seeds of despair between Israelis and Palestinians. We used to go together to Bethlehem to meet Palestinian lawyers and to Ramallah to meet our Palestinian friends in El-Haq. The space and the political reality has changed dramatically, and encounters between Israelis and Palestinians have been almost entirely eradicated. Not much is left from the joint Israeli-Palestinian ventures for peace or from our joint Israeli-Palestinian human rights movement. We have a few small groups of Israeli anarchists and Palestinian villagers jointly opposing the wall. Some Palestinian and Israeli activists who still demonstrate in Sheikh Jarrah,